Carpetbaggers by Kofax. Chapter 2. Rhea had proven their trust almost immediately when she realized they had almost nothing to eat in the castle. She had disappeared into the fields and returned an hour later with 3 rabbits. "Oh," Lucy said, staring at the still warm bodies Rhea had laid at her feet. "They're not... I meant Miss Dong is..." The sound of a wolf laughing was remarkable. It made chills run down Lucy's spine. At the same time, it made her laugh, too. "No, Queen. These are but poor dumb animals. No Narnian would eat a talking beast, not even in dire circumstances. And think you not that in 100 years of winter we had dire circumstances?" The beavers had had plenty to eat, Lucy remembered. But perhaps they were rich, or lucky. She stared at Rhea, thinking for the first time about how long 100 years of winter would really be. No gardens would grow, and it would be too cold to hunt most of the time, and the days would be short. Did people starve?" The wolf cocked her head, ears twitching. "Indeed, Queen, and worse." "What's worse than starving?" asked Edmund, picking up one of the rabbits. At home, their meat had always come from the butcher's skinned and cleaned. Lucy didn't think even Peter knew how to skin a rabbit. "Outlawry and betrayal, my king." Andrea's eyes met Edmund's in challenge before she turned and disappeared out the castle's front gate. Lucy wasn't sure she liked Rhea. Edmund stared after Rhea for a moment, face blank, then shrugged and picked up all 3 rabbits. When he spoke, he sounded like he was forcing himself to be cheerful. "Lou, I want to learn to cook rabbit. It'll be a nice change from fish." But Lucy remembered the worms and decided she would help Peter look for the secret passage instead. She found him on his throne, 1 foot tucked up on the seat and his chin resting on his knee. He looked frustrated, but smiled when she came in the door. "Oh, good! You came to help me. Ed's no good at this. I've been all over this place, Lou. I just can't find it." Lucy stood in front of where they thought the secret door was, because the stool went clunk there, and folded her arms. "If I were allowed to do a secret door, where would I be?" She heard Peter laugh, but she ignored him. She had found Father's keys, hadn't she? And she had known to trust Tumnus when no one else did. And Peter and Susan and Edmund sometimes thought too much about things. Not everything was as complicated as they claimed. The wall behind the 4 thrones was gray stone from the floor to a raised lip at about the height of a doorknob, and then pale creamy stone above that. The raised lip was actually a narrow line of carving. Winged horses followed elephants and bears, and the crevices in the stone were still colored red and blue where the paint had stayed bright in the years since anyone had lived here. "If I were a secret latch," she said again, stepping forward to run her fingers along the railing, "I would be somewhere very close to the door so nobody could see me using it." One of the animals in this section wasn't an elephant, a winged horse, or a bear, she noticed. It was a lion, and as Lucy pressed against it, there was a distinct click. A breeze wafted across her face as a 3-foot segment of wall suddenly swung outward, revealing a dark entry. Peter wouldn't let her go down the stairs, she had discovered. "I will never doubt you again, Queen Lucy, but no, you still have to wait." Until he'd run down to the kitchens and brought back Edmund and Susan. Susan was still complaining when Peter towed her through into the throne room, but she stopped talking when she saw Lucy standing next to the great wedge of darkness behind the stone door. Susan liked to act like she was all grown up, but Lucy could tell when Susan was just as excited as the rest of them. She was simply quieter about it, that was all. "Come on," Lucy said, and couldn't help bouncing up and down. "Can we get down?" "Careful, Lou," reminded Edmund. "Don't get your hopes up. It could be just the dungeons." He had 2 short candles in his hand, and Peter held a third, sheltering the flame with one hand. Lucy stopped bouncing. "Dungeons? Oh, really, Ed? But I thought this was a nice castle." "Don't worry," said Susan, and frowned at Edmund. "Nobody hides a dungeon behind a secret door." She patted Lucy on the shoulder. Finally, they were ready, and Peter led the way because he was the High King, and besides, he had the candle. But Lucy insisted on following right behind him, counting quietly as they went down 16 stairs, and then they were at the bottom. "It's not a dungeon anyway." Peter walked into the middle of the large room, holding the candle up to light as much as possible. There were tables along both walls, topped by shelves that went all the way to the ceiling. "Oh," said Susan, and brushed past Lucy to pick up something from a table. "It's a library, I think. It's all books and papers." Edmund followed her and then lit one of his candles from Peter's and went on to another table, and then another. "Trading records, taxes, census documents, even diplomatic reports. It's not a library," he said, his voice excited. "It's better than a library. It's an archive. Peter, we found the Royal Narnian records." Lucy sat down on the bottom step and sighed. Papers! She had been hoping for a treasure room, something exciting like gold or magical swords, not boring papers. "I just think someone should stay here in case more people come. And besides, someone needs to look at these records." Edmund waved a hand at the pile of papers and books he had carried out of the archives room and stacked against one wall. This small room, not far from the chambers where they had all been sleeping, had plenty of light from windows that looked south and west, and the north wall had a lovely faded mural of dryads dancing in a wooded glade. It might have been the office of a high minister or an important courtier, once upon a time. Edmund pictured himself here studying the records, learning all about Narnia from words written down 100 years ago or more. Susan, however, shook her head. "Nobody's staying behind. What if you were alone here and something happened?" She had changed out of the blue gown she had been wearing for days, and somehow managed to avoid staining as Lucy had hers, and was now wearing a sturdy tunic and breeches just like the boys. She thrust a brown wool blanket into his arms and slung her bow and quiver over her shoulder. She looked like an outlaw or an adventuress. Edmund hesitated. He really didn't want to stay and look at the archives. There was so much they didn't know about Narnia, after all. Where everything was, were there any towns, what were the major industries, did they have enemies? But the truth of it was that he didn't want to leave the castle and meet more people who would look at him the way Rhea did. So he just shook his head. "Edmund," said Peter from the door. He looked like he'd grown another inch somehow, and he'd changed his sword belt so Reen and Tilt stuck up over his shoulder instead of hanging at his waist. "I need you to come. And so do the Narnians. They must meet you. They must meet all of us." There was a click of nails on tile floors in the hall, and then Rhea's nose poked into the room. "It's time to go, King, if we don't want to sleep wet." Peter nodded, and she withdrew, muttering something under her breath that Edmund didn't catch. When he'd talked to Aslan that day he'd been rescued, he had thought everything would be better now. When Aslan had said it would be hard work, Edmund hadn't understood, even though he'd said he did. Edmund the traitor, people were going to say. "You don't understand," he said, his fists clenched, looking away from them. It was so easy for Peter and Susan, who got everything handed to them. They hadn't fouled everything up, they hadn't nearly ruined it all, hadn't betrayed Tumnus and their siblings, and Aslan himself. And now they wanted him to go out and let everyone stare at him. "No," admitted Susan, but she came over and hugged him anyway. "But we have to go, Edmund. You realize that. All of us. Aslan named you king too." Edmund thought about spending his entire life in this little room, growing pale and withered by himself, and yet still shook his head, trapped and uncertain. It would be so much easier not to go. Except that wasn't what Aslan had said. He'd said, "It will be hard, Edmund." Peter put his hand on Edmund's shoulder. "Besides, if you stay here, I'll be completely outnumbered. Even my bodyguard is a girl. That's hardly fair, Ed." Susan swatted Peter on the shoulder, and he clutched at his arm, crying, "A hit! A hit! I am undone! King Edmund, you must protect me!" Edmund tried to hang on to his anger, but it was too much like when they were younger, when they had all gotten along so much better, laughing and playing in the garden for hours. Maybe Peter and Susan were right. Maybe it could be like that again. He flung his hands out in surrender. All right, I'll come. Just clear out of here and let me back." "Bring it!" shouted Peter, and actually picked him up in a great hug. "Don't keep us waiting. I think Ray is looking hungry." "So, where are we going?" Edmund asked, trying to adjust his bedroll so it didn't interfere with his sword belt. It was bulkier than the others, since he had in the end shoved 2 books and 1 packet of papers into the middle of it before wrapping it all up. It was ungainly and heavier than he expected, but he wasn't going to complain. at least not where anyone could hear him. The trail they were following, Edmund had seen no roads since coming into Narnia, was narrow and winding, taking them on a leisurely route northwestward and away from the sea. The trees here were mostly pines and oaks, their needles and leaves bright green with new growth and full of birds and bugs. Edmund slapped at a mosquito before wondering if Narnia had talking insects too. Rhea didn't look back at him from where she paced slowly at Peter's side, but she said, "There is a settlement of dwarves at the foot of Pattering Hill. We should arrive there about sunset if we do not dawdle." "Dawdle!" thought Edmund, and rolled his eyes at Lucy, who just smiled at him sympathetically. She had picked up a stick and swished it through the tall grass alongside the trail. A butterfly startled up and circled around her 3 times before fluttering off into the trees. "Is that the nearest settlement to Carpetbaggers?" Susan asked. She was walking in the center of their little group, keeping up easily with Peter's steady pace. She had found herself a knife somewhere in the castle, which she had strapped to her belt. When they got back to Carpetbaggers, Edmund decided he would have to follow her because he didn't understand how she could find so much in what appeared to be entirely empty rooms. Rhea leapt easily over a fallen tree and didn't wait for the rest of them to climb across it before continuing on. Edmund offered Susan a hand, but she didn't need it, and Lucy clambered right across with a grin. She already had mud splashed on her boots and grass stains on her knees. She was completely happy. When they had caught up with her, Rhea answered Susan's question in a roundabout way. "The witch didn't want anyone going near the castle, even though it has the best harbor on the coastline. The dwarves of Pattering Hill have a small fishing camp they use sometimes up the coast north of the Care, but I doubt they'll be there now." "Dwarves fish?" asked Lucy. "Should they not, Queen?" But Rhea went on without waiting for an answer. "The fishing camp at Black Point kept many Narnians alive during the winter, as there were very few other sources of food." But certainly people must have eaten something other than fish, Edmund thought. It was a big country. What are people doing now for food? Rhea's steady gait hitched, as if he'd surprised her, and she turned her head to give him a long, level look. "Point for me." "Aslan's summer has forced many fruits to ripen, and animals, both dumb and talking, are breeding as fast as they may." "Ah!" Peter scratched the back of his head. "That reminds me, Rhea. Aslan broke the winter, and it's obviously summer now, but do you know what time of year it is outside Narnia?" Susan took a sharp breath. "Oh, that's a good question." "I don't understand," said Lucy, and neither did Edmund, although he wasn't willing to admit it. "Wasn't it winter everywhere?" "No," said Rhea, and her ears went back as though she were thinking. "The witch's winter only extended to Narnia's borders. The lands outside were unaffected. When I was a pup, we often spent part of the year in the western wild, where the winters are harsh, but the summers are lush, and there is much game." Edmund still wasn't sure he saw the problem. "So, if it's summer here..." But Peter cut him off, speaking slowly, as if he was trying to reason it out for himself as well as the others. "It's like getting 2 clocks to be at the same time. If one of the clocks says it's noon, and the other says it's 6 o'clock, you have to speed one up, or turn one back, to make them read the same, right?" Edmund thought about this and was concentrating so hard that he walked right through a big mud puddle without seeing it. It wasn't until he felt the wet seeping through his boot that he looked down. "Blast! Alright, let me think. So what you're saying is, if it's winter in the rest of the world, then it will probably stay summer here a long time so that the seasons line up, right?" Ducking under a low-hanging branch, Susan nodded her head vigorously. "And if it's autumn outside Narnia," Peter finished it for her, "then we're going to have a very short growing season and a fast, hard winter." Rhea growled and then snapped at a fly on her flank. "I begin to understand why Aslan chose you all," she said, although her voice was irritated. "I would not have thought about that, and now I see that winter's end does not mean we are free from worry." "No," agreed Susan, blushing at the wolf's unwilling praise. "And if everyone is having children, there will be many more mouths to feed and not much more to feed them than there was already." "Well, do we know?" asked Lucy, scratching at her nose, which merely served to smear mud even further on her face. "What season it is out there, I mean?" "No," said Rhea, and picked up the pace. "We do not." It was warm under the trees. The air was hot and still. and Susan thought longingly of the breeze on the towers of Carpetbaggers. She could feel the sweat on her back under the strap for her quiver and plucked at the front of her tunic. They had been walking for most of the morning, with a short break for water when they crossed a small stream, and in that time they had climbed some distance into the hills Susan had seen from the castle. In England, she would be panting and exhausted, her feet blistered and her muscles aching. But here in Narnia, it was different. She was working hard, but her body felt stronger, fitter than at home, as though Narnia itself, or perhaps Aslan, was ensuring she was strong enough for the job she had to do here. She glanced back over her shoulder at Edmund and Lucy, following her up the latest rise, their feet kicking through 100-year-old leaf litter. Just then Peter gave a soft exclamation, followed by a growl from Rhea. Susan spun back around, her hand reaching for the bow slung across her shoulder. It was unstrung, and would take a valuable second to prepare for battle, but she realized after a moment that they were in no danger yet. Astride the narrow trail, blocking it completely where it had been empty before, was a great figure in brown and green, his features hidden in the shadow of the trees. As Susan stepped forward, coming up behind Peter, she realized the stranger was not a giant, but something else, something she had not yet seen in Narnia.
"You trespass in my wood, wolf,"
said the stranger. Up close, his clothing was not in fact clothing, but bark and leaves. His body resembled a great tree trunk, his feet planted so solidly in the ground they might have grown there. The beard on his face was more like twigs than hair, and acorns were caught in it. Rhea stood her ground, although she might have been squashed flat by one step of his mighty feet. "You hold this wood in stewardship from the great lion, oak god," she replied calmly, though her hackles were lifting. "And Aslan himself would never bar honest travelers from passing through."
"Aslan!"
rasped the oak god, and acorns fell from the trees around them. Susan caught her breath and reached one hand behind her to grasp Lucy's arm.
"Aslan left us to freeze. What care I for Aslan? My saplings shattered in the cold, their livestock freezing in their trunks, and dwarves burned their shards in the furnaces. Do not speak of Aslan to me."
"Even though it is Aslan who ended the winter?" challenged Peter, head thrown back to meet the oak god's eyes. "Aslan who saved us all from the witch?" The oak god bent forward a long way, leaning down far enough to look closely at Peter. He unbent one gnarled hand and poked Peter in the chest with a woody finger. Peter swayed, but did not stagger.
"Humans,"
the oak god said with a snort and raised himself back up to his full height.
"Aslan and his pet humans again,"
he said, and the sound was like the wind rushing through the forest. He looked at Peter again, and then at the rest of them, his glance touching on Susan like a cool breeze before shaking his head. He stepped back and sideways, clearing the trail.
"For all that he has failed us, I will not challenge Aslan. I know the deep magic is beyond me, passed on through humans and wolf, but I think you will find few enough to shelter you here in the north reaches. Begone from my wood."
And with that he was gone, the trail empty before them with no footprints to mark his passing. Rhea shook herself, shaking every bit of her body in sequence from her head to her tail, before setting off up the trail without a word. "Blimey," said Edmund, and Susan nodded. Aslan had not mentioned this sort of thing. She began to wonder what else he had not mentioned. They stopped to eat an hour later, after crossing a low ridge and dropping down into a shallow valley. There were fewer oaks here, Susan noted with relief, and Rhea brought them to a halt at the edge of a wide clearing. "We should be safe here," she said, and sat down to scratch at one ear with her right leg. Susan choked back a laugh. She was still adjusting to the fact that the talking animals of Narnia were people while still animals, and shrugged off her bedroll and weapons. They spent the next few minutes drinking water from the nearby creek and eating cooked rabbit and greens collected from the edge of the meadow. After they were settled, Rhea disappeared into the brush, and did not come back for some time, reappearing finally with a satisfied look and a spot of blood on her coat. They were apparently not pushing right on yet, and Susan leaned back against the boulder and stretched her legs. It was still hot, but cooler in the open, with a light breeze rippling the grass in the meadow. She stared out at the scene, unwilling to think about all they had to do and the little they had to do it with. Birds swooped over the grass, chasing bugs in the warm air. Susan sat up suddenly, actually looking at the grass instead of past it. "Edmund," she said, and poked her brother. He'd been dozing, and he started up, grabbing at his sword hilt before glaring at her in resentment. "What?" Susan pointed at the meadow. What do you see here? He followed her hand, eyes narrowing.
A field.
A field of what? Susan could not be imagining this. The rocks and boulders they had sat upon for their lunch were clustered along the edge of the meadow, and the grass in the center was remarkably even in color and height, as though the land had been cleared.
Edmund leapt to his feet. A field of corn! Susan, you're brilliant! What? Peter rolled over from where he had been sleeping face down in the grass. What is it?
It's a farm, said Susan, or it was once. She walked out into the meadow and squatted down, her boots sinking into the soft, dark soil. The crop was nothing she recognized, but then she wasn't a land girl. Young green stalks grew a foot tall, mixed in with some other three-leaved plants that clung to the earth. Perhaps a weed, or perhaps the two were planted together, the way it was sometimes done.
Rhea,
said Edmund, who had followed her out into the field.
Was there a farm here, or a village nearby? Who would have planted this?
The wolf's ears twitched the way they did when a human would have shrugged. I can't answer you. This is not my countryside, and I was born but 20 years ago. Whoever tilled this land is many years gone now. There was a farmhouse over there, I think, said Lucy, pointing up the valley. There was a clear and level spot sheltered by the hill, and close to the creek, where great stones lay tumbled about. If Susan squinted, she could imagine those boulders were a sturdy stone house, and maybe a barn as well. Peter clapped Lucy on the shoulder.
Good eye, Lou. Which means there may be no way to harvest this crop when it comes to time, though. We'll have to make sure it gets done.
Susan had the sudden image of herself wielding a scythe under the blazing sun and groaned. Are we going to have to thresh and grind our own corn? Ah, Peter, we are kings and queens. This simply cannot be what Aslan meant for us to be doing.
You would not have brought them across the worlds to farm, after all.
Edmund flinched, and Lucy looked shocked, but Peter met her gaze evenly.
You knew Aslan as well as I do, Sue. I would not presume to speak for him.
Well, Susan pressed her lips together, flushing. After a moment, she said stiffly, Should we go on? Don't we have some dwarves to visit? Peter didn't say anything for a long moment, but then shrugged and nodded.
Yes, let's get moving.
They met no one else on that day's walk, although a crow passed overhead at mid-afternoon, circled back, cried, Humans! Humans in the north reaches! And disappeared west over the trees. When they took a break a little while later, Rhea went off to drink from the creek they were following upstream, and Peter turned to Susan. She had been silent since lunchtime.
Sue, I'm sorry I said that.
He needed Susan with him, even more than Ed and Lucy. They couldn't afford to be at odds. She tossed her hair in that affected manner Peter had hated even before they came to Narnia, opened her mouth, and then hesitated. No, I'm sorry, she finally said, and she looked a little blank. I think that being kings and queens in Narnia won't be like being royalty in England. It won't be all parties and pretty dresses. She looked down and tugged at the front of her tunic, then raised her head again, her face solemn. We're here to serve, I think, not be served. Lucy hugged Susan, and there was a lump in Peter's throat. He swallowed, forced a smile, and put a hand on her shoulder, tugging at the strap of her quiver.
Even if it means harvesting and grinding corn?
Even if, she agreed, although she rolled her eyes a little. I do hope, High King, that Aslan won't ask it of us. He had to laugh at that. He could not see either of his sisters on their knees before a grinding stone, dust in their hair. Indeed. But speaking of what Aslan is asking, I think we need to plan how we will approach the dwarves at Pattering Hill. You heard what Rhea said about them. Then Peter laid out his thinking before all of them, squatting in a circle, while Edmund drew random squiggles in the dirt with a stake. It was Lucy, surprisingly, who disagreed most. But then she was also the most trusting of Aslan's plans. She seemed to think that if they simply stated who they were and that Aslan had sent them, things would fall into place.
But Lou, explained Edmund, you saw how the oak girl reacted. I don't think crowning at Carpetbaggers is enough for many of these people. They've lost a lot, and some of them blame Aslan.
Until now, Susan added, we've mostly met Narnians who were fighting the witch openly, or at least resisting her some way. They would naturally support us and Aslan. But I think there are likely many people who just stayed quiet and tried not to get into trouble. They weren't in the battle, didn't see Aslan, maybe don't care about the prophecy or human kings and queens at all.
Lucy's face scrunched up as she thought through this.
But we're not going to lie, she said finally. That wouldn't be the right thing to do either.
No, assured Peter with some relief. But we're not going to march in and insist on being called King Peter, Emperor of the Lone Islands, Knight of whatever, and so forth either. We need these people and they need us, but we can't even learn how to help them if we offend them right off.
Rhea cocked her head.
That is a wise line to follow, King. Dwarves are proud, and those at Pattering Hill have kept themselves better than many in this country. They will not welcome a new ruler merely on your say-so. Or Aslan's even.
All right, said Lucy, her voice still doubtful. Susan gave her a quick hug. It'll be fine, she said, although she shot a quick glance at Peter that was anything but certain. It better be fine, thought Peter, and pushed himself to his feet, brushing the dust off his breeches. Or this was going to be merely the first of many uncomfortable meetings. On we go, he said, and waved Rhea forward to lead them over the ridge to Pattering Hill.
Humans in Narnia, said the Clan Mother, tapping the edge of her ale cup against the table. How unusual.
She had not offered them anything, although Rhea had said that Narnian hospitality was both generous and sacred. Instead, she merely stared at the four Pevensies from dark eyes and a withered face. The clan house of Pattering Hill was a low stone building, built into the steep hillside to shelter it from the north wind. The main hall was long and low. Behind the clan mother, Peter could see several doors leading deeper into the hillside. The hall was sparsely furnished, but for a long table on short legs and even shorter leg benches. The Pevensies sat on the floor and still felt too large for the room. Except for Lucy.
So we understand,
said Susan. She met Peter's eye, and he gave her a tiny nod. She would likely be better at this. He ignored the way Rhea shifted her weight uncomfortably.
But many things have changed, Susan continued, now that the witch is dead.
If they thought to surprise the grandmother with that news, they were disappointed. She merely pursed her lips, as unimpressed as she had been since they had appeared at her door. The fading sunlight through the windows did not illuminate her face, which was deeply scored with age and worries. Peter wondered how old she was, and if she remembered the days before the witch had come.
I have heard this news, she said, but there have been thaws before in the winter, more than once long enough to stop planting, and then the hard freeze strikes again and all our labor is lost. What proof have you?
Edmund stirred, but Peter raised a hand, and his brother kept his silence.
What proof would you accept? Asked Susan, still with that calm voice, as though she were pouring tea from Mother's knitting circle. We do not carry around her head in a bedroll, and her body is scattered to the winds.
The clan mother nodded, considering this. What of her wand? She asked, and Peter saw her eyes glitter. This she found important. Susan turned a hand over, motioning gracefully to Edmund.
My brother shattered it in battle. There will be no more such devilry in Narnia.
The clan mother's head jerked minutely in apparent startlement. Finally, thought Peter. The half-dozen dwarves arrayed beside and behind the clan mother, male and female, whispered to each other until the clan mother lifted a finger and they all went quiet.
Impressive, if true,
she said, glancing at Edmund. Peter clenched his fist to keep himself silent, and you could see Edmund struggle not to respond to the implied slur.
Susan, however, stayed calm. We have no reason to deceive you, mistress, she said, but this is, however interesting, beside the point. We are here with a purpose.
Ah, said the clan mother, and put her ale cup down with a thunk. So we come to it. The witch is gone, but her demands must still be met. She had her armies to pay, and now your treasuries are empty. I am unsurprised, but you may find us less malleable than she did, especially without her wand. Her dark eyes flashed.
Demands? Indeed not, mistress, countered Susan smoothly. We are here to discover what you need. The winter is broken, and the roads are opening. The fields are springing to life in the warmth of Aslan's summer. What can Narnia bring to the dwarves of Pattering Hill?
There was a silence, and Peter bit his lip hard to keep from grinning. Susan had shocked the dwarves into speechlessness. She went on.
There will be markets for your coal and your silver. Soon there will be grain for fresh bread, greens for your dinners, even beef and pork from the herds on the South Plains. Carpenters will be needed at Carpetbaggers and the great market at Baruda to build furniture and houses, and, Aslan willing, even ships, to carry your fine silver and your cousin's ironware across the seas. Tell me, mistress,
said Susan, and she leaned across the table and dared to put her young brown hand on the clan mother's tough, age-spotted wrist.
what can Narnia do for you?
We have them, thought Peter. Oh, we have them. The grandmother laughed, an enormous guffaw that echoed off the, admittedly low, rafters. Oh, you are fine, girl. You could be one of my own, your tongue is that silver. She swiveled her wrist and caught Susan's hand in her own, peering at it closely before releasing it. And I see you are still young yet. You will be tying them in knots when you are grown. Susan might have blushed. But, asked Peter. He heard it coming. The clan mother looked straight at him with eyes that were as shrewd as Rhea's and far older. You'll be the eldest, then, she said. Well, son of Adam, I think we shall have many a fine talk betwixt us about the weathers and hows of Narnian trade, but for this day and the next, that is not our concern. And what is? Her face went still and hard, the dark eyes flat. All trace of humor was gone. You say Aslan broke the witch's winter, and that's as may be. What we know is the workings are flooded, and my youngest son's team trapped in the North Oak seam by the rising waters. Which is how, on their first night away from Carpetbaggers, instead of receiving a hot dinner followed by a mug of ale and a warm bed, the Pemansees found themselves thigh-deep in frigid water, heaving on pumps all night, 100 yards underground.